Welcome to the Long Game Podcast, where two industry veterans share perspectives and stories from the front lines of private equity in Asia. I'm Nino. I'm joined by Carlos, and together we're your two hosts. Carlos, how does this podcast find you?
Good. I'm just enjoying a sunny morning here in Bangkok. I assume you're in the dystopian environment of Hawaii today, perhaps?
That's right. Yeah, the hellscape of Oahu, as denoted by the Aloha shirt. Good to see you.
Right. Yeah, it's
and so this is our first official full sort of episode, and of hopefully a growing library of episodes where we talk about key topics around private equity through the lens of two practitioners, and in particular, two kind of operating partners, I guess, in Asia. And so there's going to be a real kind of value creation kind of spin to things, but I think we won't limit ourselves to that, and we'll talk about private equity practice more broadly. And for this first episode, we thought we'd focus on the first 100 days, or what's euphemistically called the first 100 days. Let me just pull up an overview.
Yep.
So we've thought this would be a good place to start. And I think the contents of this episode might actually be a bit of a thumbnail sketch for a number of sort of deeper dive podcasts that go into some of these areas in even more detail. But we thought we'd start with kind of an overview of what we propose is kind of a value creation framework, or a way of launching value creation with new investments. I guess what the management consultants would call the 100-day plan. And I guess so the topics we're going to cover are these 5 bullet points, but it really starts with this concept of time and why time is so central to driving returns in PE investments. And it goes beyond just the IRR shot clock, which everybody's familiar with. There's some subtleties around that we want to cover. We then want to move into sort of a few stages, I guess, of the framework. But I think a key thing to highlight is just the importance of having a framework. We're proposing this as kind of a starting point for people to consider. But I think the most important thing is having a framework that you can use to engage with management teams, boards and board directors, advisors, and giving people sort of like points of attachment and a framework that gets people away from talking about, well, what should we do? And really gets people moving into how should we execute as early as possible. So I guess the way we had thought about sketching this out was, a few key time frames in the crucial first 6 months, starting with the stuff that we have to do before the deal even closes. So this important period between signing and closing, where really it's important to get ducks in a row in terms of key leadership decisions. Then there's kind of the launch phase, or the engines on sort of phase, where in those vital first few weeks, we want to be building management awareness of what the program is going to be, and start the process of building expectations and aligning expectations. Then over the first couple of months, really, and no more than a couple of months, empower the CEO to build a plan. And then over the first couple of quarters, as the team moves into execution mode, to really put in place the infrastructure to be able to assess and fine-tune, the launch trajectory, the telemetry, as it were, of the deal. So that's kind of the framework that we'll be going through over the course of this episode, starting with the importance of time as a resource in PE investment.
Yeah, before we get there, I just want to interject, in broad terms, what I found in these exercise, and by the way, we, especially in my TBG days, which is probably the biggest chunk of my experience, we call it the value creation plan, VCP, but it's all the same stuff, right, fundamentally. And but we invested the time, and I'm sure you guys did in Bearing to develop actually, kind of checklists or toolkits to define, what is the potential universe of things you need to think about. And I'm a big fan of checklists. By the way, I highly recommend. There's a book called The Checklist Manifesto. You may have
Yes.
you see that, a great book. And yeah, so we had such things. Now, of course, you don't want to err on the side of like ticking every box, right? It's like color by numbers. But in fact, use what is relevant. And of course, every situation is different. So yeah, having it for a GP, taking the time to invest in developing that is very useful. The other thing I'd also mention is that you know, and we'll talk about how value creation relates to underwriting in a minute. I think it's useful in the next section. But in my experience, very often there's always this kind of happy outcome type of scenario that's drawn where everything is like up and to the right in terms of growth of the business and profitability of the business, et cetera. And the reality is that shit happens. My sniffle. Shit happens. And of course, there are black swans, and nobody can anticipate a black swan. But sometimes there are things that are reasonably to be anticipated. So, for example, highly concentrated B2B businesses, the loss of a customer, or a group of customers is something that is not unforeseeable. And that should be anticipated, and there should be a section of VCP that sort of addresses downside shocks. The last thing I'd say also, and maybe this is a nice segue to the roll of time discussion, is I think the analogy is, the VCP itself and the life of the investment and how the VC plays out over time is neither a sprint nor is it a marathon. I think it's like a 1,500-meter race. It is time bounded, but it's not a flash in the pan either. And over a 1,500-meter, your body will go. And I haven't run one recently, but your body will go through all kinds of cycles, and so you have to have a certain pace, a certain level of intensity, but not the kind that you would running 40 kilometers. Yeah, just wanted to share those before we kind of kicked off. And you wanted to talk about time, the most important thing of all.
Yeah, and I guess the way to kick this off would be to say that obviously, early on in the life of the investment, there's the opportunity to kind of set expectations and get the management team, get the whole organization really to kind of operate at what's probably a higher like metabolic rate than they had been previously. So I think that's important. And I think that, of course, they're unlike other modes of ownership, typically these underwrites are somewhere between 3 and 5 years. And so the shot clock is definitely something that is kind of, should be front and center for all investors. But I think there's something kind of deeper than that around kind of organizational psychology around the importance of these first few weeks and months, which is that, how it is when just around an acquisition, the organization kind of sits straight up in its chair and is kind of anticipating, what's next. And there's this kind of nervous energy around the place. And, I've learned, I guess, we collectively as an organization learn kind of the hard way that if you take too long in kind of defining, where we want to get to and who the leaders are going to be, and okay, now let's build a plan. If that process takes too long, the organization is kind of sat back on its haunches and they kind of settle back into kind of,
old habits.
Yeah, old habits and kind of business as usual. And so you've missed that catalytic opportunity, right, to capture that nervous energy right around the acquisition and translate that nervous energy into, kinetic energy and sort of propulsion. to belabor the metaphor. So there's
These
a
are all
really
great.
important organizational psychology element to this, I think.
Absolutely. I mean, these are all great metaphors, in fact. And I think when we talk about like day one and the early days, I think we probably both have examples of how that can be made. Not going to be done the right way, as far as I'm concerned. But just broadly, when you think about time, and we talk about, I think everybody who's listening to a podcast will be familiar with terms like IRR, and we used to call it MOM or MOIC, fundamentally the same thing, basically just simple return on capital over time. And at the end of the day, as we used to say, you eat MOM or MOIC because that's the delta accretion of capital, hopefully, is actually what you in fact consume and redeploy. But the time value of money is very important too for all kinds of reasons. Certainly to recycle capital, and increasingly, I think the industry, LPs are focused on using IRR as the best sort of single benchmark of GP performance. And yeah, I just came off of a deal. I'm working on a new one now, but I just came off of a deal in Korea that was a 20-month. It's actually my second 20-month deal, and it was a good outcome. Wasn't eye-popping from a MOIC standpoint, but it was absolutely heroic from an IR standpoint. And everybody runs their victory lap for that. So, but anyway, so time is important as a general matter, whether you're talking about 20 months or 4 to 6 years. There is this importance, as you say, of having a what do you call it, the metabolic enhancement,
or let's call it the heart rate. Maybe is better.
Yeah. It's like when you have this. I did one of these some years ago. The heart MRI, where they inject your system and get your heart pumping faster. So that's a little bit too much sharing. Anyway, yeah, I think that's important. The other thing I'd say about time is, and I'm sure we'll echo this throughout, but it is so important to align the principal actors, and those being, of course, the deal team, the ops team that supports the deal team, the CEO, and the immediate, CEO, direct reports, to get them all aligned on not just the content of and the direction, but also the pace that we expect, given as we expect. This is something that at the end of the day is collectively developed, i.e. the VCP is collectively developed, but everybody needs to be aligned on pace. And so that's what I would add on is time question.
Yeah, that's great. There is one thing, maybe just to put a pin in this, and maybe we can revisit some of this stuff, in more depth in subsequent episodes. But there's something also from a portfolio management perspective that getting a head start on, call it a good proportion of deals that the GP does in a given fund, it just creates so much optionality from a portfolio management perspective. If you've got a deal that's kind of ahead of the curve in terms of its value creation trajectory, it creates all kinds of latitude for the GP to say, okay, to release pressure, at a fund level to exit a given deal, in a way that might seem premature for that deal on a standalone basis, but it makes sense from a portfolio management and portfolio sort of construction perspective. Just that added flexibility, I think, is gold for GPs.
It reminds me of a story that you and I actually share, kind of. My first encounter with you is when we sold a certain company in China to you guys from my previous GP, and that was an exit in 3.5 years, or even less than 3.5 years, which we, in all honesty, specifically did for portfolio construction reasons. That was part of a fund that was relatively underperforming. And we were able to kind of take a victory early on a successful investment that had been successful. Thank you very much, Mr. Buyer. I think that's what I did. And actually take that and as a to help sort of counterbalance the overall portfolio. So you're absolutely right.
Yeah. So extending on, I guess, from this concept of urgency and baking in kind of like, the awareness of time is really that kind of uh, critical, magical period between signing and closing, and kind of
Yes.
making sure that everybody's kind of in their starting blocks, I guess, during that period. And I guess the few things that I think are critical to highlight, and keen to get your thoughts on these, and what else would be useful here. First of all, obviously, as part of the underwrite, there's going to be, you guys called it maybe a VCP. We thought about it in terms of like the from to case. Like,
Mm.
we're going to take this business from X to Y earnings, and maybe reposition the asset, and maybe there's a multiple expansion story that we can credibly underwrite. Whatever it is, there's a from to kind of vision. Um, and we were always looking for opportunities to kind of share that from to case, with kind of the broader leadership group, so that there's kind of awareness of kind of what good looks like from a GP underwrite perspective, and start the process of kind of socializing that case kind of as broadly as is feasible. Obviously, all the stuff that happens before close, it's all contingent on sell side, sensitivities. Different deals have different restrictions around that. If it's a secondary, there's some considerations. If it's a family held business, there's all of those considerations need to be folded in. But I think the lesson that we took away was to push against, that kind of time frame as aggressively as we felt we could. The other key thing I think during that initial period is to get one's ducks in a row in terms of leadership. And in particular, we always found like if we were still kind of half pregnant with who our CEO was going to be, or who our board chair was going to be, post day one, and if that extended sort of like well into the first half of a deal, I mean, that was as good of a lead indicator of a deal that was getting off to a slow start as just about
Yeah.
anything else. So let me pause there and see how those elements kind of played out in your experience, Carlos.
Yeah, I do want to talk about the CEO selection in the cases where you're transitioning from an incumbent. But what I just want to go back to underwriting for a second. And, every situation is a little bit different. There's, for me, underwriting and the value creation plan, or the 100-day plan, whatever you want to call it, the transformation plan, they just go hand in hand. I mean, they're two peas in a pod. And the degree in which that is co-created with the existing management team, supplemented by folks that we're bringing in, it depends on the number of considerations. And I think you correctly point out that before closing, there's a sell side component. A great example is, where we predicate certain outcomes, economic considerations, an earnout is what I'm talking about. When we negotiate an earnout in the terms of a deal, which is by definition realization of certain, let's say, upside outcomes in the short term, usually in the first year or two, and tying that to the economics of what the seller will enjoy. So obviously, our ambitions to define what that is, and their tolerance for what they would be willing to put at risk, is a matter of negotiation. But stepping more broadly, I mean, again, as I say, underwriting and value creation, they go together. They have to be. I think there's obviously an importance of a certain alignment. Now, whether the authorship for the plan initiates by folks like you and I, the deal team, or something that's really a three-legged sack race with the new CEO, it's just is a form of art. Well, the other thing I'd say is ultimately when that stuff gets laid out and what we've underwritten and what we're actually road mapping in the VCP, that has to get reflected in compensation. for a team. And it's easy to get over complicated and over, subtle about this. But at the end of the day, revenue growth, EBITDA growth, those are pretty fundamental concepts. And the magnitude of those have to be baked into, basically variable compensation. Typically, and we can talk about the theory of compensation maybe in another episode, for CEOs, but basically, say annual variable compensation should be very much reflective of the underwriting and the value creation, and in fact, conservatively so, such that the team actually has a higher goal to achieve, to ensure they actually achieve that, and then they get appropriately rewarded. The last thing I'd say is about, well, maybe I'll just pause it because I think it'll transition to, well, before we talk about day one, sometimes we bring in a new CEO. I think it's almost, if we're gonna bring in a new CEO, it's almost criminal to not have that person ready on day one. And because it's so important, as you say, to get out of the block, in the starting blocks with the team and all the communication that comes with it. The other thing I'd say is part of the VCP also has to have an assessment of talent that is then not just done one time, which is sort of part of the due diligence, but actually gets revisited on a cycle, let's say an annual cycle. We used to call it Session C in GE days. We can talk about all the piece parts of that, but that's something I don't want to lose sight of. Is you see you in place. He's got a team. He or she has a team. We review their performance at a certain interval. We tie their compensation to certain outcomes. That's all stuff that has to be reflected in the VCP.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's a couple of post-it notes for potential further deep dives, in subsequent podcasts there. The point about compensation is interesting, and I'd like to, just as a placeholder, just kind of flag this for us to explore later. I think absolutely vital that that the underwrite and the investment outcome, is really closely linked with variable compensation and really like wealth creation opportunities for senior management. I think that, like, as a first principle, I think we certainly found that as well. Where we sometimes got a little too cute, a little too maybe intellectual for our own good, is we tried to drive that philosophy a bit too deep into the organization. And as a GP, no matter how operationally oriented you are, I think there's the risk of running afoul of decision rights and respecting a hierarchy there, and kind of letting just respecting the dividing line between non-executive and executive in a deal, and getting that balance right. So driving it deep enough so that it's effective, but not so far deep that you're kind of second guessing, the role that management needs to play. I thought was one that we hadn't necessarily gotten right in all cases.
Yeah, I mean, you can certainly overthink these things. I would say that the functional leaders who are typically direct reports to the CEO, head of supply chain or finance or customer success, whatever it is, that these people are ultimately going to be the owners of major spikes that are in the VCP or the plan, and they should have, if it could be qualitative as well as quantitative. And again, I think we'll probably have a deep dive into theory of compensation in these deals in another episode. But I'd say CEO plus one, so those functional leaders or business unit leaders also, to the extent that the VCP reflects a major needle moving in their space, they got to own that and have that reflecting their compensation. And I don't think you need to go further than that, because they're smart enough to figure out to align their people below that with those goals.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. It's something just sort of occurred to me that might be a helpful kind of yardstick for this, is to say, like, the members of management that you would want to put in front of an incoming buyer to present the sell side case. that population you would want to make sure, has the opportunity to really participate in like, in real wealth creation as part of the, of the comp structure,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
not
I mean,
beyond that really necessarily.
yeah. It's interesting. Yeah, and you're right. And I think you should already on day one be thinking about, the final days, and who you want to have, articulating that whole arc of outcomes that, and there's some people who are better than others, but ultimately, again, folks who, if we need to have, move, move a supply chain, from China to Vietnam, experience that I participated in once upon a time, twice upon a time. Yeah, you need to have the guys who are the functional leaders there to be compensated appropriately. Um, so yeah, compensation. We'll definitely come back to that. But should we talk about day one? The
Yeah.
the excitement of day one.
So day
I'm a
one,
big yeah. Go ahead.
now I was going to say day one to maybe day 14, really kind of those precious first couple of weeks, and really no more than that.
Yeah.
I think really, best practice looks like treating that as the launch. And, there's a lot of calories need to get expended during those first couple of weeks, really all oriented around just creating awareness. And what you want to really avoid, I think, or I've certainly seen examples kind of go pear-shaped and need to be kind of triaged when kind of like vacuums of information form, like post close, and management teams are wondering like what's going on, how are the you want to be shaping the narrative, like to the greatest possible extent during those first few weeks, so that you're just not allowing space for those kind of information vacuums to form. And really, I guess the key topics typically that you're doing, and the mechanics tend to be some version of road shows, physical presence between
Yes.
key members of, whether it's the board chair with the new CEO or the incumbent that you're endorsing. Either way, those people need to be front and center. Key members of the GP investment team that are going to have an ongoing role, advisors, that are going to likely play a role. And so the idea is to create as much visibility, for that, and as much endorsement for that future state, team as possible.
Right.
And I think the
Yeah.
types of things that typically we were sharing were, this is really the opportunity to kind of unveil and create and build the case for like what's the from to, and to try and build excitement, on the part of the management population of this was kind of the outside in assessment of what we think this business can become. It's transformative, and we need the team's involvement in making the transformation happen. So, building awareness around that from to case, sharing that value creation playbook, and, creating a sense that, this is for whether it's the CEO, the board, the GP, this is not kind of our first rodeo. Our sector expertise, our track record at having driven these kinds of transformations before, and we've got kind of a cookbook, to make it happen. This is the advisory ecosystem that we can make available. And then maybe thirdly, I would say, is to really in those first couple of weeks, make it clear, like what the steps of the VCP plan are going to be, but also like what the business review cadence and what the communication protocol is going to be. And this to me is really core to that notion of upping the heart rate. Just making it very clear as early as possible that we're not going to be just kind of reviewing, P&Ls and balance sheets once a month. The nature of private equity investing is very information hungry, and it extends to non-financial metrics. And the reason for that is not because, we want to second guess and shoehorn our way into management. It's more about, again, the value of time and the need to be able to identify what strategies are working and which are not, and how the environment is shifting before it has a chance to impact our financials necessarily in a significant way. So, sharing the from to underwrite, talking about the playbook and the track record, and endorsing the team that's gonna drive it at the senior level, and giving some sense of what the governance around the plan is going to be. Those were, I think, my takeaways of kind of the big three, kind of in terms of like the content of the messaging.
Yeah, I mean that's a very good list, and it's a lot to cover in these set of sessions. I want to almost bring it back to the human drama, right? That I've seen in Japan, China, India, and Korea as well. Like literally day ones, and I mean, the Japanese are as formal as they get. The Koreans are up there too. But even in India, I can remember when we did this big retail deal. Literally day one, we assemble kind of a town hall, and there's you have to address that from the beginning, and especially with the new CEO, we had a practice even before my P did from GE, General Electric. We had a thing called new leader assimilation, which I think I experienced. I was in CBN when I first took up a post in Japan an eon ago, and in a senior role. The new leader assimilation basically brings the CEO, it's an opportunity to introduce the CEO or the leader in an important role to their team. And in a nutshell, what it is you assemble the team there, and you basically take a half day to do this. You assemble a team there, that leader presents their like vision and does a little bit of personal introduction, and it's kind of can be pretty free form. And then the leader's taken away to, out of the room, and the team is allowed to, a big, what you used to call butcher block paper or Post-its or whatever, ask questions. And the more probing and intimate, personal, professional, whatever, questions about that leader are constructed, by one author, and there's no attribution. Nobody had any idea. And then you bring that leader back, and they have to actually address those questions live, and no, I'll come back to you on that type of responses. Now that's a kind of and then the day ends with a heavy drinking session, right? And team dinner. That was a good practice, but just generally, having that CEO out there if they're new, and presented in that literally first day. And of course, a big organization with a worldwide presence requires a bit of management by flying around. And so you take that CEO on the road and you replicate that session in different places, as well as tie it in with customer meetings, especially for big B2B type of companies. And that's very important. And then of course that sets a certain tone or style that gets replicated in town hall meetings that you would have over time, maybe once a quarter, depending on the business, and that you would broadcast as widely as possible to some folks who are live and some folks who are remote. The communication thing is so important, and then I'm a big believer in literally day one type of grab that podium, and make sure people understand that there's something new has happened, is very important. I'll come back to the business review cadence. I think you touched on that already as we get into on the first day or two.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I mean, I'm kind of just thinking about our pre-PE kind of background in more corporate type settings, which I think stood us both in good stead in terms of I think about like acquisitions that we were probably both involved in integrating, and just how serious that and how just much project planning really was involved in managing those integrations. And it struck me certainly, very vividly in the days before we had this playbook kind of put together and aligned with everybody, like how almost cavalierly these closing events were treated by some of the investment teams, just because, maybe by virtue of the fact that they hadn't had that experience of what it's like to be on the receiving end, like an organization being acquired and being left to kind of fend for yourself in terms of piecing together the narrative and the information. And anyway, I think that sort of that more whatever corporate, for want of a better word, approach to kind of running M&A integration in a military kind of way, I think is a good
Formality.
yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, so
Yeah.
that's a good overview, I guess, of the first couple of weeks, and then kind of extending that theme into the first couple of months, and hopefully no more than really a couple of months.
Yeah.
Is really so. The awareness has been built, and now it's about channeling that common awareness into really shared alignment around a plan. This is really around building kind of, so we've got the from to underwrite aspiration. And really, I guess this next stage is all about the CEO taking the lead, with enablement and support from the advisors, the board, et cetera, translating that aspiration into a granular plan around like, what are we going to do to deliver? And I think about this in terms of, a robust plan probably includes like, what are the key drivers or initiatives or spikes? I think you had mentioned, like, what are the things that we're going to do that are going to unlock that value? And I think critical to that conversation, and I think it's worthwhile making this explicit, is like, what are we not going to do? Like, like be very clear about the trade-offs and like the bets that we're placing, right?
Yeah. Yeah. No, exactly. I mentioned at the top about, I've seen kind of over checklisting the psychosis where like, we're going to do, it's what do they teach you in golf? Like do a effective drive. You have to remember only 23 things. Have your body remember 23 things at the same time to achieve. And you'll never be successful that way. That's why I've never been successful at golf. I think too much. No, but seriously, I think that, it is like you say, things that will be, we're not going to do or lower priority. So we can be sharply focused on what really matters. That's important. And then, and you touched on the review process and it's also the measurement. I mean, with each initiative has appropriate KPIs, is commonly called, that are associated with determining those outcomes. And those things aren't just the mundane P&L balance sheet type of metrics, but in fact, and they're not, neither are they just, sort of bland storytelling assessments, but ways of actually measuring, let's say, leading indicators that drive those outcomes, and having those in a pack that get reviewed, not necessarily at the board, but some of them maybe, in fact, but certainly at the management senior review meeting, which in many organizations is, let's say, at least monthly, where those KPIs just get methodically reviewed over and over. Having that script, that definition of those measurements associated with those major initiatives, having that baked into that pack, and being able to actually gather the data to feed that pack, that's something that has to get shaped early.
Yeah. I always found the focus on inputs and KPIs and metrics predating, my days in PE when I was a manager running a sales division or whatever it was. Just a great way of grounding conversations with my teams around things that are under our control. So outcomes, are invariably going to be influenced by a bunch of stuff that's out of our control, but
Exactly.
core of things that we can control. And I always found it really helpful to just align with everybody, what are the things that are under our control? And and always anchoring and bringing the conversation back to those things. Just as a way of keeping the energy of the
Yeah.
organization, focused in productive ways.
Yeah. Well, they're saying the same thing about inputs over outputs. I mean, or outcomes are, in fact, all kinds of exogenous factors, but measuring those inputs that are the leading indicators or the driving forces. Yeah, that's important to be measurable and categorical. Um, so you talk about this first. Let's talk about the first quarter. I think that especially with all the drama of those first days, people do expect, and of course it depends on the situation of the business and how ambitious the plan is, but people do expect after a quarter for something tangible to be seen. And it could be just, a subtle change in the company culture or how communication happens or, the tone at the top, whatever it is. Or it could be outcomes with customers in the marketplace. So those early wins are important to be achieved and communicated, celebrated. People expect to not just have a lot of sort of foreplay of planning, but actually see some points on the board, something modest though they may be after a quarter. And the other thing I think that has to happen in the first quarter, I mean, I think you and I have both been on boards that are monthly boards or quarterly boards, and there's a certain wisdom of both models. And and again, I think I will come back to the board topic in much more depth later. But committee structures, whether to even have a committee structure, and if so, what are those committees? Seeing those things set up so they actually start to going through their process of discovery within the company and preparing. That's the thing that should happen. If you're gonna, I've seen a lot of dysfunctionality in boards in private equity. By the way, I'm sure you have too, where people like after 2.5 years, hey, we should probably have an audit committee. For a business that is transaction intensive, which is just begging to have to have controls around fraud and whatnot. So yeah, I think that kind of structure has to get set up for the duration in the first quarter.
Yeah. A great point, by the way, on quick wins. I think that's a key thing to really be on the hunt for, in the first iteration of the plan. And one of the things that always struck me was a lot of times, you're acquiring these businesses. I mean, leaving secondaries aside, maybe where this is less the case, but whether it's a family-run business or a carve-out, say, from a larger corporate entity, by and large, you have in these businesses that were maybe neglected in one way or another, or there were aspects of leadership that was a bit neglected. There's these frustrations, that build up on the part of, key functional constituencies. And to the extent that you can identify quick wins that resonate, like here's something, we've been banging our heads against for years, some way in which, we weren't listening to our customer base, or some process that was antiquated and a real pain in the ass. To the extent that you can demonstrate that with this new ownership structure, the organization is going to be very much, sort of results oriented and responsive to those kinds of things. Those kinds of quick wins, I think, can be real energy boosts.
Yeah, I'm reminded of a story in my association with ELF, ELF, the now ginormous mass market beauty brand. That's just
Did you see, by the way, just on ELF, I noticed it made the Goldman Sachs list of stocks to watch just last week. I saw that getting
yeah. They're all the time getting these type of accolades, and their CEO is appearing, in CNBC and all this. I mean, they're just firing on all cylinders and just have not let up. I'm thinking about this kind of that early win. Like I remember the challenge. So I was involved. The brand is very much focused on the U.S. market. I was focused entirely on the supply chain, which is almost entirely in China at that time. And the mundane, challenge I was doing on day one is to achieve in the first quarter a logical, comprehensive, sort of mutually exclusive, comprehensively exhaustive, robust lot tracking system. So as you know, in high volume consumer products, where you have potential quality issues or adulteration issues, you want to be able to track the integrity and the sequence and the source of lots of items that get produced. And yeah, we'll give it that task. Let's just focus on that in one super mundane but super impactful and task. We had one, but it was total fucking chaos. And we achieved that after a quarter. We actually had that nailed down, and people felt like that's real. Very, very pleased with that.
Yeah. So just circling back to like the plan and kind of like what constitutes a fully baked plan.
Yep.
And then I want to talk a little bit about specifically the role of the CEO as distinct from the role of the board in this process. But in terms of what ought to go in, I think to a fully baked plan, we talked about the what and therefore the what not. But I also think that, a lot of times what was getting missed out in some of our earlier iterations of this before we specifically called it out was kind of enablers, really stuff around the how. And that includes, like organizational capabilities, things like, our internal systems, aligned with kind of the scale growth that we're anticipating, like just by way of, like examples, like things that would always get everybody groaning is you're kind of like 3 years into an investment and all of a sudden a request comes through to put in a new ERP or something. And it's like, no, like
that never happens.
Yeah, that's right. Like these are the kinds of things that, are knowable, like a couple of months of business, I would argue. And key enablers like that. Because the other thing is like the beauty of private, of a private hold is that, you're obviously relentless in terms of the outputs and the expectations at exit. But there's a lot of flexibility in terms of front loading investment, if the investment case is made, in a coherent way. And so things like front loading investment in systems and enablers are things that a lot of freedom, in a private ownership structure to do that kind of thing, that if you're public and you're beholden to the quarterly, whatever cycle, you can't really do. So enablement, I guess, is the thing.
Yeah, just the system infrastructure is something that I found, especially buying family-owned businesses, almost invariably these businesses have, I would say, rickety, jury-rigged systems, often built in Excel. And I've been through, countless cycles of implementing, ERP, CRM, data warehouses, dashboards, and I'm sure you've been through all of the above. I know you have. But this is stuff that's, as you say, very knowable. It's something that's just, you want to, if the business is lacking there, and you certainly don't want to do a brain surgery on yourself unnecessarily, because that's what it is often. Do you have an incumbent, robust set of systems? But if you're inheriting a, family mess, and you need to make those investments, and they're going to take a year or two in some cases, and you just need to start early and make those investments, and they will inevitably be important to the measurement of progress in the VCP and any development. So that's just stuff that just has to get baked in from the start, and shouldn't wake up after 2 years and decide you need to You know,
Yeah.
that should be very knowable in the beginning. So, so I think we're kind of heading toward the end game. Well, the end game,
We're
the end of
close.
the beginning,
I
the end
had
of the
one
beginning,
item. So I think
the
we're
first
close.
half.
I
Yeah.
had one item that I wanted to add
Yes.
to this section, which is, and I guess you would generally you could put it under the enablement bucket, but I think it deserves to be called out. And you had mentioned session C, I think you called it.
Yes.
But like a component of enablement is clearly around organization and talent. So like
Mm.
starting with org structure and like, how the business is divided into teams and
Yeah.
how those teams align with the priorities or the strategies or whatever that are going to be pursued. And then, the individual key talent decisions. And here we're talking about really the short list of, the top, whatever, 15, 20, no
Yeah.
more than that, sort of executives that are going to be on the hook, for delivering those key elements of the BCP.
Sorry.
Bless you. And
Yeah. Yeah.
I think it's
Yeah. Go ahead.
important for the CEO, and CEOs worth their salt will not need to be told this, but a key part of the plan will be just a sober and clear-minded review and assessment of, where do we have A players already on the field who are like properly aligned with those needs? Where have we got clear gaps that we need to start, resourcing right away? Where have we got, amber alerts, right, of people who have some things that are in line, but other key areas where there may be gaps and real kind of attention is required. So, like having that kind of radar around, talent requirements to enable, I think, needs to be in place in the first couple of months.
Yeah. Also, where you have A players that are such stars that they're at risk of not being able to retain them. And for those situations, how do you both retain them and also hedge in terms of succession? And G went like crazy about succession planning. It was like very military organization type of, here's number 2 in line, here's number 3 in line, all this sort of thing. I also want to go back to, I was smiling when you were talking about organization chart because I've had a couple of situations, but probably you have too, where one of the first questions you ask during DD or as you get, as you're preparing a plan is, we take a look at the organization chart and being confronted with organization chart. Well, it's, very often family businesses, right? There's the founder, maybe the founder and his wife or son, and then like the whole world orbits around them, basically. And that's the organization. I can remember, I could think of some colorful stories in China and also in India. I remember this certain company in India had a CEO that basically their meetings consisted of almost the entire management team circling the guy's desk in like 4-hour marathon meetings and 30, 40 Indian managers like surrounding this thing. And if you've been to Indian management meetings like I have, it's like an opera where everybody's singing at the same time, and it somehow makes beautiful music. And these meetings, and there's no need to have an organization. Basically, you have essentially the dictator is barking orders at whoever it happens to be. There's no functional ownership, et cetera. So yeah, organization chart cannot not have that. It's not something that is to be trivialized or treated as some kind of military. I mean, people have to see where their ownership is and accountability. So
Yeah.
anyway,
I mean, that's a key theme, isn't it? Of like, so the types of deals that kind of come out of the initial whatever family led or whatever entrepreneurial energy, and then they come into the hands of PE, and typically that's because they've come to a stage where that model just no longer can sustain the kind of growth that had gotten them to where they are. And
Absolutely.
fundamentally, there's just an inability, as a lack of capability to comprehend real delegation of responsibility, and like developing not just doers, but managers and ultimately leaders, and
Yeah.
that's just a muscle group that's not present. And it typically falls to it falls to the likes of us and our boards and the CEOs that are right for the task to build that capability.
100%. Yeah. I mean, I think we've both seen situations where you had such strong, and again, typically family founder type of leaders that when they get either by design or otherwise decapitated or the organization basically collapses like a souffle because people are just accustomed to being instructed and following. So anyway, I'm watching our shot clock. I think we wanted to just wrap up with talking about the sort of the first half and kind of the
Yeah.
end of the beginning, I guess.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess everything we've talked about up until this point is really kind of getting the rocket positioned and, the engines fueled up and fired, and we've got lift. Hopefully, we're off the launch pad. And so now it's really about just kind of putting in place, the approach to kind of just check and adjust our telemetry. And so really, we talked throughout those sections about starting to build kind of the infrastructure around inputs and metrics and review processes, the role of the board, and the role of the management team. And this is really the time to put that through its paces. And there's a lot of fine tuning typically required, to get that, to get, the right sort of metrics identified, to get the measurement systems in place, and to get everybody comfortable with their roles in this kind of new system. Because I think one of the things that's important is, and it's a question of balance. Absolutely central that the CEO feels that they have the agency to do their job and to be in charge
Yes.
of executing the plan. But also for the CEO and for the board to recognize like where that dividing line between executive and non-executive sort of responsibility lies. But also for, the CEO and the board to be comfortable with and clear about what the role of the board is. And, this is probably like a whole subtopic when we do come to talk about boards.
Oh yeah.
But getting these decision rights, clear during this first couple of quarters, I think is an absolutely critical piece of work. Let me pause there.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I'm smiling because I can think of a couple of examples. One in Southeast Asia, one in Japan, where a certain operating partner was a little bit too. I don't want to take full blame, but I have a certain style, and depending on the individual CEO, they could actually be a little bit intimidated. And I've had situations where the CEO was like unclear about what levers they were pulling and what levers we were pulling, which is and that's on us to define that clearly and ultimately to make it very clear that the CEO is running the business day to day within the confines of our overall aligned plan. And you should never have a CEO like sitting there like nervously waiting for instructions. That's fucking nuts. And so it's a good learning. I think unfortunately what you see in private equity very often, I'm talking about buyout, which is typically what we're talking about here, is sometimes not just the operating folks, but the deal folks don't give enough room or just don't send the right signal on empowerment or like the term you used to the CEO on what they're responsible for and have them get on with it. And they should not be waiting for any kind of tattoo instructions from us. So that's an important thing to get right.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that like great CEOs, and not every deal benefits from having a great CEO, and we can get into that, but I would say that great CEOs get this stuff like intuitively, and they will be they will be as part of their plan, like proactively looking for every lever to kind of use the first 6 months to kind of catalyze the transition that we're talking about. And
Yep.
so great CEOs will say, look, you had me at VCP. And they will take a framework like this and really run with it. And it's really the role of the board to enable, bring advisory talent and the network to bear and kind of run to catch up with the pace of the CEO. And if you sense the CEO is that type of athlete, that's a clear indication that the role of the board, the role of the GP really is, don't be second guessing all the time.
Cheerleaders.
Exactly.
Shaking your pom poms.
On the other hand, if it's a question of dragging the CEO kicking and screaming to see the benefit or just the essential nature of doing this work that we're laying out, I think that to me is a clear red flag. That you've got probably a maintainer, a manager where you need a leader. So just a couple of thoughts there.
Absolutely. So I think we're approaching an hour. I just wanted to one kind of last lob in and thinking about kind of the end of the beginning, as I call it, is the importance of just fundamentally. Well, I remember we used to always say there's nothing more important than making year one of your underwriting. So you underwrite, a certain revenue growth, a certain EBITDA growth, and maybe some outcome on the balance sheet. And that just is non-negotiable. Must make that in year one. And the best way to be sure you're on track for that is by the first half actually being on track. And shit happens, but I think that's the one thing that is just that kind of puts it kind of the cherry on top is just confirming that in fact you are on plan to achieve those out. Because then especially internally within the GP, you lose credibility if you're from the first half or the first year just not on track in a fundamental way, like underwriting. And I remember, I can think of a certain case in Japan where we actually was during the year of the earthquake, tsunami, nuclear disaster. We actually still made our plan for the year despite this tremendous headwinds, and we moved heaven and earth to do that. Wasn't easy, but that and we were not expected to have done that, but having done that, we now have credibility.
It's a great point. Well made. And it is remarkable how winning and conversely losing are habits that get baked into organizations. And it's the role of leaders to break those habits where needed, to shape those habits. I think that's critical.
Yeah.
So I think we've covered a lot of ground. I think that goes by way of kind of a 1 hour sketch of what's really a large group of topics. And I think this almost serves as a table of contents for a bunch of, specific items on value creation that we can come back to. So look forward to revisiting some of these themes in more detail in subsequent episodes. And let us know, by the way, in the comments below, won't you, which of these items are of greatest interest, and engage with us down in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, do all that stuff. And Carlos, it's been a pleasure.
Absolutely. Always a pleasure, and I'd say, there's lots of topics, they get to double click into what we addressed. And I look forward to starting to bring on some of our guests that we've been thinking about to shine some of their perspectives on these. So all that's to come. We're just getting started, but I hope you're having as much fun as I am. All right. So there it is. Talk to you next time, Nino.